So glad you're joining us. My name is Larry Parsley. I teach at Baylor's Truett Seminary. I teach spiritual formation and oversee our mentoring program. I cannot even plug in a three-pronged cord, and so I don't know how I'm up here with engineers today. But I'm really grateful for our topic and what brings us together. This will be our format. We are going to have each of our three presenters offer a way too short summary of their work, and then we'll leave some time after each presenter for questions, and we'll do that times three. And so I'd love to, an honor to introduce our first presenter, who is Josh Brake. He is from Harvey Mudd College. You left sunny California, and these two left frosty Michigan, and we're so glad all three are here. Josh his expertise is in electrical engineering and optics. He did his study at LeTourneau and at California Institute of Technology, where he earned a PhD in electrical engineering. And Josh's title of his talk is "The Metaphor is the Message: How We Describe Our Machines Shapes What They Become." So please welcome Dr. Josh Brake.
Thanks so much. This is going to feel a little bit like theater the whole time, and I'm speaking into the mic, but it's not picking anything up, but we'll roll with it. So today I wanted to talk about the metaphor is the message, and many of you will likely recognize this phrase as a riff on the phrase of another media critic from the mid-20th century, Marshall McLuhan, who said, the metaphor is the medium is the message, right? And I think that as we think about generative AI, one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that metaphors are carrying a lot of weight. And the main point I want to make today, and the challenge I want to have for all of us, is that I hope that we can take a little bit more time to think about the metaphors that we're using to talk about generative artificial intelligence. Because I think they're saying more than we might think. And they end up being part of a rhetorical strategy that's being used by Silicon Valley and the people who are creating these tools to tell us not only what they are in a descriptive way, but also prescribing a certain way that they hope that we interact with them. And I think we have to be mindful of that. So these are just a few of the folks that have really been influential in my own reading and kind of life of the mind over the last number of years. And from Ursula Franklin, Canadian physicist, metallurgist, who is a wonderful critic of technology, to Jacques Ellul, Ivan Illich, Marshall McLuhan, C.S. Lewis. And the main thing I want to say here is that in reading a lot of these folks, what you'll quickly realize is that the problems that generative AI is posing to us today, in 2026, are not new problems. They have new skin on them, in that they're labeled with new fancy marketing techniques, and it is a new technology. But the problems that they are challenging us with are fundamental problems about technology and the way that we interact with it. And it's actually not so different, many of the core questions. And so I think that these folks are a real treasure trove of wisdom for us to dig into. And I want to spend today just digging into a riff on one of those thinkers. So in the effort to start with the end in mind, think about where we're going. Just a kind of roadmap of, if you take nothing else away from these 20 minutes, here's what I hope you come with. First of all, is we're still grappling with what generative AI is exactly. Never mind what it should be or ought to be and how we ought to engage with it. So this is still so rapidly evolving and things are changing so quickly that it's tough for us to get a handle on things. And so I think we do need to, this is why the metaphors have become so important and powerful and why people are using them, is because we're struggling to try to get a shape of what this thing is and how to understand it. As we grapple with Gen AI, we're putting quite a lot of weight on the metaphors. They're carrying a lot of freight in ways that we don't often recognize. And this can be helpful, but also carries with it a lot of dangerous things that we are not paying enough attention to. The way that these metaphors are being used, both by people out there and by us, are forming and deforming our understanding, not only of what the tools are, but what we should be doing with them. And we have all this wisdom from the past, the societal impact of electricity, the railroad, the automobile, the road. All of these things actually have lessons to teach us about generative AI. It's not as if the whole playbook is brand new for generative AI. There's a lot of wisdom from the past for us to deal with. Okay, so this is where I go to try to tell you in 2 slides what Gen AI is. You probably are familiar with some of these front-end tools that you're using or you've seen used in your day-to-day life. Most of these are tools that are the big tech players, right? So eventually, Microsoft and Google got into the game with Gemini and Copilot. Apple Intelligence is the one that doesn't work yet. Actually, talk to me another time. I think Apple actually has a chance at winning the whole thing. It's very funny if you look at the CapEx graphs of what's being spent. Apple is basically flat on AI because they're just shooting in a different direction. It's an interesting strategy. Not this talk. But you probably know about these tools, but I think the best definition of trying to get your hands around from a perspective of what generative AI is comes from Brad DeLong, who teaches at UC Berkeley. And I really love this definition because it's very compact. I think it's technically correct, even if it's not technically very detailed and rigorous. But he says, generative AI is a flexible interpolation function from prompts to continuations. You can see how outdated this is. I made this at the end of last year. All of these models now are no longer the frontier models by at least one version, right? But the basic idea is you have a function here. Functions have inputs and outputs. Your input to a generative AI function is the prompt, right? Which is really nothing other than data, a vector at the end of the day that gets sent into the LLM. And then the LLM does its fancy algorithm thing inside of there. It's nothing but a really, really, really fancy, complicated algorithm, which is awe-inspiring in many ways, to give you the continuation. What are the likely next things that come after that? And what's kind of amazing about this thing is that it's useful and that it works as well as it does. Some definitions. The flexibility piece is actually quite important here. Computer scientists for a long time have had to deal with syntax errors and like if your code doesn't compile, right? Like you got to get it exactly right. But generative AI doesn't care if I typo things when I'm typing in the cloud. This is why the voice interfaces are so prolific, right? Because I just talk into there and kind of like think out loud for a minute, and then it doesn't matter if it's typo, it's grammatically correct, whatever. Like it doesn't care. It's just generating the next continuations from that. So this is powerful and sort of new in many ways. The interpolation thing is to say that the things that it is generating are generated from a probability function that is trained on the things that it has already been trained on. So it's training data. The interpolation means you might have 2 data points here, and it's making up one that is in the middle of those 2 things. So just like you might have a line that's made from 2 data points, you can interpolate points along that line, which is to say the data points don't exist at those points, but you have a function that you fit to the line, and so you can add more points to it. That's effectively what's happening here. The thing that's interesting to think about here is things already within the data set. So this is why there's all these kind of debates about whether generative AI can actually be quote unquote creative or create new novel things. Because from a technological perspective, it's looking within the closure, essentially, of all the things that it's been trained on. And the last thing is the function piece, which is to say, this thing takes inputs and gives you outputs. Now, of course, this is the large language model itself, and the tools are rapidly changing and improving as they're stitching other things around the large language model thing itself, that function. And so now you'll see that there's a lot of work in the frontier of what they're calling agentic AI tools, which is the LLM is used basically to orchestrate and glue together different things that are already very powerful in the computational building ecosystem. So the fact that my LLM can figure out how to write a bash script or a Python script or write an HTML page is actually quite powerful. And the fact that it can translate my natural language prompt into that structured format is also very useful. But this thing at the root of it is this large language model. That's what's driving it, and things are being put around that. As we think about generative AI, the metaphors abound. You know many of these. We describe it as a stochastic parrot. This is one of the famous ones from Emily Bender, Tim Nickerbrue, and Meg Mitchell. Blurry JPEG of the web. This was Ted Chiang. Amplifier, Balaji talked about it as amplifier. Mirror of human intelligence. This is Shannon Valor. Cultural technology, Alison Gopnik, Henry Farrell. Normal technology, these are the guys from Princeton who are talking about that. A brain, a conscious being. Blake Lemoine, right? That's the big story of back in the day, the Google engineer who thought the AI was conscious. And not only do we use the metaphors to describe what it is, but we also say certain things about what it is doing. We use words like thinking, reasoning, learning, hallucinating. All of these things sometimes have scare quotes around them, as in like we know that this isn't exactly what's happening in the way that we mean this word or we say this word, but it's close enough that we're just going to like, most of the time now people are just leaving it off. And if, ruminating. If you're like me too and you spend a lot of time, I'm spending hours a day basically in Claude Code these days building things, they have these things called spinner verbs. These are the things that when you get that little pulsing thing at the bottom, that's what it's doing. And so these things are essentially, you're like, now you can give personality to Claude by customizing your spinner verbs. So this was like a Star Trek one, right? Beaming up, right? It's kind of cute, right? And at like one time we're like, it's kind of like, does it really matter? We're saying it's thinking, it's reasoning. It's not really doing any of those things in the way that we have traditionally meant those words to mean that those things are happening. I think the answer is like, yes and no. We got to be careful. Because I think while the metaphor all points to something that is a similarity, oftentimes metaphors are always limited. Abstraction is always limited, and so we lose something. And these are pulling along a lot of things along with them, especially because of the way that the chatbot interface is the default interface, which makes you think that there's a conscious being on the other end, because every text message thread you've ever had, minus the ones that were really lousy on the internet in the yesteryear, right? You could tell that there was another human on the other end. So let's take a little bit, I want to just try to be a little bit provocative here and say, let's take a look at a few common metaphors that are used to describe AI and just examine them a little bit more closely. I think this is the kind of practice that I would encourage us all to do, that I'm trying to do in the midst of exploring the frontier and seeing what's there, to actually try to ask questions and critique the way that I myself, in using these tools, are being shaped and formed by the language that we use around this. And I thought it would be kind of fun. Came this morning, I was in the back, like, what if we just mapped them onto some similar rhetorical shortcuts from Star Wars? Okay? So metaphors are a wonderful tool for smugglers, right? Because you can smuggle in a whole bunch of stuff that, like, you want to get across with something without actually saying it. But people get it. They don't even realize they get it. It's just kind of in the water. They're both descriptive and prescriptive. We talked about this. They leverage pre-existing understanding, and to help us make a mental shortcut, that's the whole point of the abstraction, is that you don't have to keep all of the details and get caught up in the nitty-gritty. And they also come with off-target effects, which oftentimes is the point, actually. It's the payload that really matters, and the metaphor is just the delivery mechanism. To get you to treat this thing as if it was another conscious human, even though you know, if you stop to think for 10 minutes or 2 minutes, that it's not. So who's the most famous smuggler in the Star Wars universe? It's Han Solo, right? And I think that this is basically a typification of the typical Silicon Valley CEO. Right? What, me? I'm holding the blaster, but what, me? You're worried about me, right? Okay, so it takes energy to train a human. This is one thing that Sam Altman talks about, right? Like, oh, come on. It takes energy to train a human, right? So obviously it takes energy to train generative AI models. Like, what's the big deal? This smuggles in all the human labor that is happening in the training, oftentimes in Africa, at very, exploitative ways that these models are being trained, and even more than the training, the alignment of them to make sure that it doesn't just, go off on these crazy rants. Turns out, like, if you imagine something trained on the internet, Reddit, right? Like, it's not going to be a very polite chatbot to start with, right? The natural resources, the data that it was being trained on, right? More on this later. And I think this is basically like, the move here is look at the hidden compartments. When you're smuggling things with the Millennium Falcon, there's all these hidden compartments. That's how you smuggle things along. And so you gotta be like, don't just pay attention to all of the stuff that's on the actual floor plan of the Millennium Falcon. Look for the hidden compartments. That's where the stuff is that actually matters. Han Solo is not gonna show you where the contraband is. Second thing, Dario Amodei, looking quite stylish in I don't know if it's got an AI touch-up or what on there, but anyway, he's holding his glasses. I throw a little bit of shade, but I think Dario is kind of my favorite of the big tech AI CEOs. But he talks about a country of geniuses in a data center. This is one of his lines as he's thinking about generative AI. Like, what exactly is a genius that we're talking about here? When you talk about a country, there's this kind of smuggling of, there's some kind of coordination, polity, there's an agreement, There's some kind of governance around this. There's no such thing here. And there's also a unit. I tell my engineering students all the time, right? Units matter. And actually, you can almost solve the problem even if you just know the dimensions of the thing, right? Like, that's a big trick. Country of geniuses in a data center. Like, does that even compute? Like, does that matter? So I think this is, pay attention to the units. Just like this, right? Han Solo, ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs. Okay, parsecs, unit of what? Distance, thank you. This doesn't make any sense, right? It's just blowing smoke, right? Made it in 12 parsecs. It's like made it in 12 light years. It's like, okay, fine, you made it 12 light years, but like, that's a unit of distance. Last one. This is to try to avoid the label of AI scraping and stealing all this stuff. Oh, it's just reading and learning like a human, right? What's the difference if it reads the entire internet and grabs all the information, right? It's just like we would read a textbook and then do something with that. Regurgitate it, use it in our own creative products. This is smuggling this idea that, again, this one is the most explicit here, that AI is like a human, but all of them actually, if you see, have some connection to the human. And this kind of makes it, no big deal. This is not so different than what has been done before. Don't need to worry about it too much. And I think, again, this is pay attention to these subtle equivalences that are being made. This is, again, just to put a finer point on the cargo that's being smuggled along when we make a statement like this. There's a lot that we're saying that, if you think about copyright law, I'm no lawyer, but right, the idea of copyright law and intellectual property as a field of study is complex, and it's fundamentally rooted, like many areas of law, in the dignity of the human person. And so we have to think about, we can't just say, well, okay, on the surface, if it's doing this thing, then it checks the boxes. We have to think a little bit deeper down about what the fundamental, what's the purpose, what's the meaning behind those laws. And maybe the fact that we have those laws on the books, we have to rethink what exactly that means in the age of generative AI because of the new capabilities of these tools. In the last couple minutes, I just want to touch briefly on some of the theological implications to kind of pull some of the threads, and hope that we can follow up on some of these later. I hinted at this before, but I think each of these metaphors is smuggling in an implicit assumption that generative AI is in some way like us. And to be sure, that the challenge there is that in some ways it is like us somehow, because it's been trained on all of humanity's output. The data, quote unquote data, that's been generated is by largely human data, right? That humans generated throughout history, that is actually being then regurgitated to us via a probability function to generate next tokens. And so we're seeing these things that look human to us. But the fact that this implicit assumption is underneath here is supporting a very particular claim about what then should be done. It's not just a descriptive thing to say, oh, look at these generative AI systems. They are trained on human data, and so they look like humans or have some similarity to us. It's actually saying something about it's making a prescriptive claim about how we should treat these in a variety of different realms, whether that's legally or in our own use of them and work with them. This was just the other day. Michael Pollan wrote this piece in Wired. And he had this very interesting line in here where he talked about metaphors can be powerful tools for thinking, but only as long as we don't forget they are metaphors, imperfect or partial analogies likening one thing to another. The differences between the two things are as important as the similarities, but these differences seem to have been gotten lost in the enthusiasm surrounding AI. As cyberneticists Arturo Rosenbluth and Norbert Wiener noted years ago, the price of metaphor is eternal vigilance. The price of metaphor is eternal vigilance. So what? Well, we must be eternally vigilant, right? We have to know what generative AI is. And I don't mean that you need to know all of the details of how it works and be able to understand it or recreate it from first principles. It's just not, even the people who are at the frontier of this field are struggling in many ways to have the explanatory power to explain what's happening with them. But we have to understand at some level of abstraction actually what's going on under the hood. We have to look at what our own use of language is doing. How are we describing these tools? And what is that doing just for the way that we, not only for the way that we describe them, but actually for guiding and shaping the way that we work with them. And then we have to think, and I think this is the great advantage for us as believers, as followers of Jesus in this moment, is that, and the Michael Pollan piece actually gets to this very interesting thing where he's kind of talking about at the end, is like, Pollan actually takes a stand that these things can never be conscious, not from a Christian perspective, but he takes that stand. But many in the AI community don't. Or they don't see a fine line between what these artificial intelligence tools can become and what it is to be a human. And so we have a very clear biblical mandate that there is a difference, what it is to be made in the image of God. And I think that the world more than ever now is actually thirsting for that answer. And so we have an opportunity in spaces that may never have been open to us before to speak about these things and invite questions and open up, well, what do you think? I think we have an opportunity to actually speak about human personhood in a way that many people are hungering for. In closing here, I'll just put this piece from Neil Postman, which is just excellent. 5 things to know about technological change. Culture always pays a price for technology. There's no free lunch. You always get new affordances, and they come with limitations. The advantages and disadvantages are never equally distributed. Embedded in the idea, in a technology, there's one powerful idea, sometimes 2 or 3. They're sometimes of an abstract nature, but it doesn't matter. They have very real practical consequences. Technological change is not additive, it's ecological. It shapes the system. It doesn't just add something in, it changes the whole thing. Talk to the horse, right? What happened to the horse, right? No longer the mode of locomotion. And media tend to become mythic. So with that, I'll close and hope that we can follow up some more in the conversation later. I got addicted to blogging a couple years ago, so a lot of the things that you'll see here are somewhere in there. My piece for this week is late because I was working on putting it here. It'll be something similar to what you just saw probably tomorrow. But anyway, would love to follow up more either in the panel questions later or over a meal or something, or via email if we can't connect while we're here. So thanks so much.
We have a few minutes for questions. Dr. Brake, if you would entertain those. What questions do you have?
What was the name of that Postman article?
5 things you should know about technological change. Yeah.
Hi. Do the recent successes in or the fruitfulness of AI demonstrate that there's something substantive about the analogical relations between the standard human brain and AI, not just metaphorical?
So it's very interesting. So I would refer you to the Pollan article was actually very interesting on this because, again, I can't speak with any authority on this. I'm not a neuroscientist. But I think the short version is there are some similarities at a level of abstraction, but the way that the human brain is wired, even as you think about neurons and the way that information is stored in the physical, reconfirmation of the neurons it's a different model. So again, this is a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I would say there's something there, but probably not as much as some people think. Is there? Yeah. Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah. So I think it's Lakoff and Johnson in their book on metaphors. They say the only way to think around a given metaphor is with a new one. There's one thing to be eternally vigilant about the metaphors that are thrust upon us, but to really uncover their affordances, we need new metaphors. So are there others that we can lay alongside that might be partial in their own ways, but correct this one that you've been critiquing about humans like machines?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I think so the Brad DeLong definition is maybe a good example of the kind of thing that I would try to turn to, which is to say, to talk about something that is true about describing the reality of the thing, which is algorithm, computer program, to put it in the correct class of thing. And then I think you're right that there is this question of what are the metaphors that we use to relate to it and find better ways. I think that we have to push back against, some metaphors smuggle more than others. So even if you think about when people talk about it as a tool, depending on what you think of a tool, some people are like, oh, tool, it's totally neutral. It's like, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. I have this conversation every year with my students and everything. It's like, hold on here. Like, you think the shovel, the length of the handle is that way for a reason? Like, there's some reason why. Or that we make axes a certain, sledgehammers are hard to, anyway. So I think that's kind of where I try to go. And part of that's probably my audience, which is thinking about engineers who can grapple more with some of the technical details. But I think that sometimes the general public also really benefits from engineers trying to translate the technical realities with as high fidelity as possible, as opposed to trying to rely on something. The stochastic parrot one is actually pretty good, I think, as metaphors go.
So, you mentioned about hallucination. Those who work with AI get lost sometimes between not differentiating between what is really real and what is not, and then floating between these worlds. That's number one. Number two, in terms of imago Dei, the image of God, and those who are not theists, they don't know how to have a reference point. So is there a possibility at times when AIs can group themselves and maybe create a cult, somehow like a deity?
I'm going to obliquely touch the last one first, and then I'll go back to the first one. In response to the last one, I think my push would be, and I've had this conversation with a lot of folks who are not believers. If you ask questions and you're probing enough, I think part of what it is to be made in the image of God is you have a sense of the ineffability of what it is to be human. There's something there you can't quite put your finger on. And I think that that's general revelation, right? In nature and in the human person. And so I think that if you create enough space, and especially create some openness to have people talk about, especially with AI, like, what does that mean for the way your own self-conceptualization, like how you think about yourself? You get to some very interesting and I think more vulnerable and honest conversations about the nature of reality and the existence of God than you might think at first glance. So that's one thing. On the hallucination point, one way of interpreting, I think, your question is like, do people who are using the hallucinating LLMs also themselves hallucinate? I think the answer is yes, right? I mean, Blake Lemoine is probably the first example of this. But I think so it's kind of interesting, and you can kind of see this in the particular areas where it's being used. And this is, in many ways, I think people still have a November 2022 understanding of what the LLMs, the way they're working, the AI tools that you're interacting with. They think that the LLM that you're interacting with today, when you type a prompt into ChatGPT, is the same as what you were typing it into in 2022, and that just isn't true. Under the hood, it's a total, so they've kept the interface the same. But if you'll notice now, again, it's gotten smart. At first, they were just like, hey, let's just use the LLM for everything to do the probabilistic next token prediction. It turns out, like the classic example, LLMs cannot do math well. It's a dumb way to do math by next token prediction. We have calculators which know how to compute these things, and they're right every time. Again, the engineers, the people building this are not dumb. They're like, oh, hey, we have this calculator. How can we hook it up to the LLM? So the LLM can interpret your response and say, oh, hey, user is looking to multiply two numbers. Let's call the calculator tool and then take the output and reform it back to the user. Now imagine that across web search, calculation, writing scripts, all of these things, like the hallucination issue, I'm not going to say it's solved, but like I don't encounter it very frequently in my day-to-day work with the LLMs. Now, granted, most of that is in like a programming coding context. But I think that it's a lot less of a technical issue than it was a number of years ago, which presents some interesting challenges and opportunities. Yeah.
I have a question. I'd like to follow up on the Johnson and Lakoff question earlier, because I think that implicit in your descriptions is the idea of the metaphor as embodied, which Johnson and Lakoff talk about. And I don't see in the current metaphors an understanding of our ability to make knowledge as embodied, whereas the LLMs are, just sort of disembodied,
yep.
or, circuits, ones and zeros, and I'm wondering if you can address that.
So this is the next wave that I think if you're talking to the people in Silicon Valley that everybody is figuring, again, give a man a hammer, he's going to try to find the solution using the hammer, which is robotics. let's get sensors, actuators into so that robots can explore. We can hook up the LLM as the quote unquote brain. I'm going to keep the scare quotes. Send this thing out into the world so we can have quote unquote experience, right? And it's all at the fundamental level based on like, can we produce the product, the exterior output of what we think is happening without a full understanding. And like, there's a lot of mystery even in like what it is to be, what consciousness is and what our own experience is. Like, again, scripture gives us a picture of body, mind, soul, strength, you know, all complex, right? But I think the embodiment is a key piece. They know that they're trying to solve it with robotics. That's the idea. Again, I think we would say that's not gonna cut it. But yes, the embodiment piece is a key thing there.
Why don't we say thanks to Dr. Bray? Our next presenter is Dr. Derek Schuurman. He is from Calvin University. Started off electrical engineer and then got a PhD somewhere in the process. Now chairs the computer science department at Calvin and is the author or co-author of two IVP University Press books. One is Shaping a Digital World, Faith, Culture, and Computer Technology. He's the sole author of that and co-author of A Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers. So, Dr. Schuurman, we eagerly await what you had to say to us.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And for those who just came, I know the mic doesn't work. It's for the recording. But thank you for coming. My topic is looking specifically at design norms and then connecting them to virtues. And design norms are things that we're using at Calvin and are used at some other engineering colleges as well. So of course you all know AI is now, you know, the man of the year, person of the year, another metaphor that's probably misplaced. And if you look at the news that's going around, we could do a whole talk about this, but you know, there's people who are, you know, who believe strongly in effective accelerationism, right? Where we need to put the pedal to the metal so that we can arrive with that AI that's going to solve world hunger and climate change and disease and hunger, and it'll wipe away every tear and we'll live forever in a new Jerusalem. But on the other side, there's those who are saying basically if we build it, everyone dies. So there's this huge angst. But either way, we need ethics. And although effective accelerationists would say, you know, forget the torpedoes, full steam ahead, because the benefits outweigh the risks. But I think most people realize we need an ethical framework. And the saddest thing, you know, quoting Isaac Asimov, is that our science is progressing much, much faster than our ethical understanding. And of course, if you go and look for AI ethics, there is a plethora of AI ethics. In fact, as I'm speaking, there's probably another ethical framework being developed somewhere. And there's actually a database online, which is a global inventory, and there's hundreds of them. And they do have some, you know, common themes, if you look at them, you know, principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, intelligibility, accountability. So there are some sort of common denominators that you find in these ethical frameworks. But I think that, you know, prior to an ethical framework is kind of understanding what are the values, what are the presuppositions, what are the control beliefs that are kind of informing these ethical frameworks. I love this quote from Alistair McIntyre, who basically said that, you know, I can't really answer the question what I ought to do until I answer the prior question, right, of which story am I a part? And of course, the effective accelerationists have a story of ushering in a new heaven and earth with technology, without God. The people who are concerned about, you know, human extinction have a kind of Frankenstein narrative that they're working with. But as people of the cross, we're working out of the biblical story. And I'm going to look at one aspect and ask the question, what would an ethical framework look like if it were informed by Christian thinking? And I'm going to turn now to an obscure Dutch philosopher named Herman Dooyeweerd. Some of you will know him. Basically, Herman Dooyeweerd was a mid-20th century Reformed Christian philosopher in the Netherlands who is most well known for looking at created reality and understanding that it's irreducible. There is 15 basic aspects of reality, although you can quibble with whether there's more or less. But basically he said there are these sort of aspectual, that reality is multi-aspectual, and that these aspects we can analyze by looking at the different aspects of reality. And he basically created a ladder of 15 modal aspects, sort of like with numeric aspects at the bottom, and then physics and biology, and then kind of going up the ladder to sort of higher aspects like faith and justice and so on. And these aspects of reality are always active when we're working in culture and when humans are doing different activities. And if you look at these aspects of reality, the lower ones kind of correspond to laws, right? F equals ma, laws of gravity and electronics and numeric laws. These are things that we can't not follow. These are things that impinge on us, that the laws are baked into creation. But the higher aspects are norms, meaning these are the things, the way that things ought to be, where we need to exercise freedom and responsibility. And these normative aspects are then things that we need to be thinking about when we're creating cultural artifacts. Of course, engineers are taught about the numeric aspects and the kinematic and the physical aspects, right? You learn all of the mathematics and the physics and the electronics that inform our designs. But in many engineering programs, you don't really learn about the other aspects, which really are activated when you're creating a cultural product. And so these aspects are normative. And what these reformational philosophers have done over time is to take the normative aspects in Dooyeweerd's modal aspects and translate them into what we call design norms, which are norms for doing design work. And actually, these were first collected and described, I guess, on this side of the ocean, in a book called Responsible Technology, which was published by the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship maybe 40 years ago now, in the early 1980s. And that book has really informed the engineering programs at Calvin and Dort and other Reformed institutions. And we call these the design norms. Every engineer learns about them right from their first course, and then actually right through their program, and then in their senior project they have to do a normative analysis of their designs, not only just the technical feasibility, but sort of the norms. And they include the trust norm, care, justice, delightful harmony, which is related to aesthetics, stewardship, social norm, transparency, cultural appropriateness are the list of norms that come out of these aspects. And these norms have been used in a lot of different publications. This is just a small sample. They've actually been used in secular publications, ACM, IEEE. They've been published in a variety of different books. And so they've been disseminated in different ways. They've been used to plan smart grids, being used to determine how to proceed with information systems, and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these design norms. In many ways, I agree with Josh, the sort of AI moment is not new in some ways. It's a new technology, but the philosophical Christian thinking that's informed technology in the past, even though it's a new entity, I think can still inform our use and responsible use of a new technology like AI. So I'm going to apply these design norms to AI very briefly. And so I'll start with the trust norm. The trust norm sort of grabs the aspect of faith and trust and reliability. And if we look at the trust norm applied to AI, it's that AI systems should be reliable, dependable, safe, trustworthy. And there's all kinds of different standards that people are working on for testing and reliability and robustness. Key questions that come with the trust norm are things like, can the user depend on the AI for its intended purpose? Do AI agents have sufficient guardrails in place? Is AI tested, audited, safe, secure? Is data handled security? Is privacy respected? And so on. These are just some of the questions that come out of the trust norm. From a Christian perspective, we'd also add, does this device or does this artifact take away from where our trust ought to be placed? Are we placing our trust in AI versus a trust in God? But also when it comes to just reliability for the intended purpose. And there's a really cool story, if you want to Google it, about an AI vending machine that was sort of set up with an AI controller, and it went off and gave people Game Boys and all kinds of other weird stuff. But can we trust these things? The other norm is the norm of caring, and this is basically the norm of love and care. This is the call to love our neighbor that basically comes directly from Scripture. Does the design show due care for all users and other stakeholders? And so key questions for the trust norm would be, In what ways does the use of AI show care for others? Who might be harmed if this AI is used? Is the design characterized by a concern for the welfare of all? And there's just some headlines that I've put on there. I think there's ways to use AI in a normative way that actually shows love and care for people in all kinds of different ways. I got some examples later in the talk. But I think one area where automation I think is really helpful is jobs that are dull, dangerous, and dirty. I mean, these are the areas that robotics has been targeting in the past, helping people with disabilities, helping, and then also being concerned about people who might be displaced by AI-related job losses. How do we deal with those situations, and so on. So these are all concerns related to the norm of caring. There's also the justice norm. Justice is a fundamental biblical norm, right? Micah 6, verse 8. We need to walk justly. This design ought to respect the rights of all users, giving what is due. Key questions: does the AI system have an unfair bias? Are copyrights respected in the training phase? Could the AI be used for unjust purposes? Does the AI respect user privacy, data rights? Who's accountable when the AI causes harm? So these are just some of the questions that arise. The book Weapons of Math Destruction is a classic. It's a bit dated now, but it was one of the early ones that began to point out the fact that when you use an AI system or data science to determine who gets a job or who gets parole or who gets a mortgage, that those systems can perpetuate injustice in all kinds of different areas, and we need to be attentive to it. AI and the norm of delightful harmony. So this is connected to the aesthetic norm, right? And if you think of one company that has a really good attention to aesthetics, you think of the Apple computer company, right? Steve Jobs, if you read in his biography, was very attentive to aesthetics and even the machines that were making the machines. He was obsessed with what they looked like and how they looked and how they operated and how form and function can kind of fuse together. So we emphasize this also in our engineering and computing program. Delightful harmony is the fusing of delightful harmony of form and function. Tools should work well and be pleasing to use. Nicholas Wolterstorff, a philosopher at Calvin, once said, "A good garden spade is one that not only digs well, but it's pleasing to use." This sort of fusion. Key questions are: can the users easily intuit the function of the AI system? So when we're working with software, this also reaches the domains of user experience and human-computer interaction and so on. Is the user interface clear and pleasing? Is there a delightful harmony of form and function, UX and HCI considerations, and so on? And AI can assist with that. AI and the norm of stewardship. So another norm is the stewardship norm. It deals with economics, but also deals with creation care. Of course, you're all aware, AI data centers have a huge appetite. AI strip mining centers have a huge appetite for water and for power, and we need to be thinking about that when we use these systems as well. We've got immense, economic resources being poured into these developments, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and so these are all concerns that we ought to be attentive to as we unfold this technology. And some of the key questions in the stewardship norm is: what is the entire life cycle of the product? Does its energy and water does it use energy and water resources frugally, wisely, both during runtime inference as well as for training? And being conscious of those sorts of things. And it includes issues like e-waste and all kinds of other issues as well, the norm of stewardship. Then there's sort of AI and the social norm. And so thinking about the social impacts of AI, and I suspect you've all heard about this already, but the design of a system and our use of AI should encourage courtesy, politeness, conviviality. I've got Ivan Illich up on there as well, tools for conviviality, but of course, people like Sherry Turkle have been talking about this for a long time, Alone Together being one of her signature books. Wendell Berry, I'm not against technology so much as I am for community. So thinking about how do technologies actually help us live in community with each other? And of course, AI is a report that came out, I think about a year ago from the Harvard Business Review, was that a lot of the uses of AI and large language models in particular was for a companionship and for people kind of connecting with these machines. And of course, you can get your virtual girlfriend. And I say to my students sometimes, what do you think about this, right? I mean, sometimes people can't get a girlfriend. Maybe this is a loving thing to do, and they, rightly so, are dubious. A relationship with an AI girlfriend is a relationship of one person that actually damages you for real, authentic human relationship, which isn't all about you, right? And so I think this is highly problematic. Of course, now there's going to be a whole army of AI chatbots that are going to impersonate people. They're going to be named. They're going to be using the first-person pronoun, for education, for therapy, for all kinds of things. I've read papers about AI pastors and apologists and all this sort of stuff. I think this sort of impinges on the social norm. If you want to read, I did a little bit of a discussion of this in the Christian Scholars Review blog in an article called "The Problem with Chatbot Personas." But I did discover one redeeming application of this, and that is the AI granny that was developed to kind of confound scammers. So it answers the phone and just bogs them down with annoying questions. That's a redeeming sort of application. So it can be redemptive when used in certain ways. All right. AI and the norm of transparency, right? This is that things should be clear. For AI, clear about data, training, testing, how it makes decisions. It should be understandable, should not bear false witness, should clearly indicate capabilities, limitations. Key questions are, is documentation clear, accessible, unambiguous? Does the AI system perform as advertised or claims about it exaggerated? Maybe in terms of transparency, which sort of metaphors are being used would be an appropriate question. Are potential dangers clearly indicate? Is it explainable, transparent? Is the AI used to promote misinformation, disinformation, propaganda? I mean, these are all problems that are emerging. All right, and then there's the cultural appropriateness norm, which has to do with thinking culturally about the impact of a particular product. This is a concern, of course, when you're bringing technology into other cultures, when you're doing service projects and mission work and so on. But it also has to do when you're creating a new artifact for a particular context, like a dentist office or for the church or for the school. The norm of cultural appropriateness means the design ought to fit the culture in which it's introduced, alleviating burdens while preserving what is good. And there's all kinds of stories that can illustrate this. But large language models also come, with cultural bias. There can be a kind of digital colonialism that happens when we impose a model on all kinds of other cultures and it's used in other parts of the world. Open source Hugging Face has a community alignment data set that they're working on. And there's other projects like one that was done for a New Zealand tribal language where they actually had the people actually collecting their own lingual artifacts and building their own large language model. It's just kind of exciting to see. Artificial intelligence in terms of an industry has a sea of dudes problem as well, which is another cultural issue. But questions of cultural appropriateness include, does the use of AI enhance rather than replace valuable cultural practices? Does it reflect cultural context in which they operate? Is centralized AI appropriate over more local community-controlled alternatives? And the sort of hypothesis with these design norms is that when you're attentive to them, and when we operate normatively in all aspects, blessings will follow. This is the shalom hypothesis. And when we violate one or more of these norms, dysfunction can be expected. That's just the way creation is made, right? If we go against the grain of creation, we get splinters, says H.H. Farmer, and I think he's right. And the sort of philosophical term for this is the simultaneous realization of norms. And of course, we can see when AI is directed towards shalom. I'm not going to say AI is going to bring shalom. It won't, but it can move us a little closer towards shalom. And here's all kinds of examples of really wonderful applications, reducing traffic accidents, helping with drug discovery, working to accelerate Bible translation, increasing crop yields, and so on. These are things not only that we can do, but things that we ought to be doing. But then the question comes, I know I'm running a bit out of time, I got a few more slides, but can ethics be taught? Like when we're teaching design norms to our students, like how do we teach this and how do we do this? And I think knowledge of ethics does not necessarily make us ethical, right? Knowledge of design norms doesn't mean we're going to follow them. There's a really cool article by Alistair McIntyre called The Irrelevance of Ethics, where you can train someone, I think he's talking about in high finance and currency trading and these sorts of things, where they can have an ethical program, snapped on the end of their college career, but actually what shapes them is the practices in the workplace where they're at and how they sort of swamp out everything else. So one does not simply add ethics to technology. And so I think norms need virtues. And so the virtues, which is the title of this track, norms describe the created reality, the world, but virtues describe personal character. And so virtues help form the kinds of people, I think, who will be attentive to norms. And virtue can be actually encouraged through repeated practices. I'm running out of time, so I'll skip through this a bit. But Shannon Valor has a well-known book called Technology and the Virtues. She identifies a whole bunch of techno-moral virtues. I would say one thing that we want to do, though, as Christians, sometimes the virtues that are mentioned in some of these books are humanistic, operational definitions of virtue, whereas in the Christian tradition, I think we have a much deeper sense of virtue in the work of the Holy Spirit also in doing that. One of my colleagues at Calvin College wrote a well-known book called You Are What You Love, Jamie Smith, about how habits and rituals form us in profound ways. And I've had some colleagues, including someone, David Smith, who's an educator, talking about what are the kinds of things we can do in the classroom to actually shape virtuous people. That education not just as, giving technical skills, but shaping a person and forming a person. I wrote a very idealistic Christian Scholars Review blog article titled AI and the Renaissance of Christian Higher Education. That as sort of practical skills become less and less important in a world where AI might automate these any day, what's really important about our education is character formation and becoming a certain kind of person. And you can read more about it there. And then this is just a shout out. If you're interested in the question of AI and virtue, I had a paper published about a year or so ago asking the question, can an AI be virtuous? And here's the hot take, no. But it could have a role in virtue formation or vice formation because of the ways they operate. And I think in the Christian tradition, the notion of virtue is much, much richer. And this is my last slide. I wrote a little article a year or two ago with the provocative title, The Problem with AI is Deeper Than You Think. And by that, I don't mean that we need more data or we need more data centers or more NVIDIA chips or more power or whatever. But the idea, comes from Scripture, right? There is this Proverbs 4, verse 23. Above all else, it's of strategic importance, right? It's above all else, guard your heart. Why? Because everything you do flows from it. So everything that we do is actually flowing from the heart. So this goes back to Augustine, well, the Scriptures, but this to the Proverbs, right? I mean, this idea that we need to be attentive to our hearts, maybe more than ever. And maybe the way that we do that is to recapture some of the ancient practices, and my colleague Harry is exploring some of those things. But ancient disciplines and practices that are tuned to shape the heart, and you made a mention about that too. And I'll end with Frederick Brooks, Christian computer scientist, ACM Turing Award, like the Nobel Prize in Computing, Christian computer scientist who passed away a couple years ago. In his ACM acceptance speech said, if we want our creations to be true, beautiful, and good, including our AI creations, we have to attend to our hearts. And so I'll park it there, and thank you very much. Yeah. And a shameless plug for Calvin College. We'll be hosting an AI, Wisdom in the Age of AI conference, October 8 to 10 in Grand Rapids. So join us there to continue the conversation. Yeah.
Wonderful. Time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
I appreciate your framework. Quick question though. It seems that what you set up, and I'm thinking more from a company standpoint, building AI, that kind of thing for enterprise solutions, that your framework is a retardant to speed. It's more contemplative. It's more, let's think about what's going on. And it seems like if there really is a difference of any kind from this technological change in ones that we've seen from the past, it seems like this one is speed. So is this more aspirational? Like it feels good to talk about, but anybody who actually implemented this would not be competitive.
Right. I mean, if the story you're working out is that AI will usher in a new heaven and a new earth, then effective accelerationism is what we ought to do. And that basically bypasses ethics completely. And so, yeah, ideologically, if you're bent that way, I think I've had students who've and people I've talked to who've used these sort of normative discussions in secular industry because they're not explicitly Christian in some ways. Like, you can frame them that way, but they're just creational. And I think a successful business in the long run will be concerned about the social impacts of their products, which there's all this bad news coming out about social networking companies and the things that they're doing to our children and so on, right? If they're not attentive to justice, right? And they're not, these sort of things will impact your long-term business line, maybe not in the next quarter, but I think the companies that may actually bubble up, I don't know for certain, but I think are ones that are going to be thinking more deeply about creating products that help people to flourish. And so, I think part of what I tell my students, some of them do go off to work for big tech in Silicon Valley, and I say, you're going to be like a Daniel in Babylon. And you need to be faithful, and you got to use whatever influence you have to nudge things towards shalom. And so we're called to be a faithful presence, and it's not up to us to change the world. It's up to God and for us to be faithful. And we need more Christians in this space to be doing that. Do you want to pick?
I saw a hand back there. Yeah, it's been up for a while. Yeah.
Well,
That's very quick. Just
okay.
to your point there,
Yes.
we are launching a book using this framework with more than 20 engineers and computer scientists showing how we apply this to AI nowadays.
Yeah.
So I kind of disagree that it's a slow framework. I think it's just the way you present it sometimes might sound like too much theoretical, but it does react very well. So,
Yes. Should we go for next? Right here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Many of the examples you gave have to do with how AI would affect creation or how it would affect our neighbor, which is important to consider. But I'm wondering which of these would have to do with how it affects us as we use it. And particularly, even if you had an AI that had zero negative environmental impact, zero bias or injustice, is it helpful for me to get instant, effortless answers? How could that undermine deep contemplative practices? Which of the norms, if any, would that fall under?
I think that's where virtue also comes into play. So the norms are attentive to what's going on in creation and community and those sorts of things. And the virtues have to do with personal character. And so I think some of the questions that you're asking would be, what kind of person do I want to become? And what practices? I think a ringing phrase that's in one of Jamie Smith's books is that we need to do a liturgical audit of our sort of technology behaviors, and I think that would be a good thing for designers of AI to do, right? What are the repeated practices that this technology is encouraging? What does it shape me into? What does it point the heart towards? The trust norm, by the way, also includes notions of our relationship to God. It deals with reliability too, but also ultimate trust. And the social norm, I think, would also include, your notion of yourself. But I think that's where virtue needs to come in. We need to be shaped into the kinds of persons who are also then attentive.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned Jamie Smith in terms of what you love, liturgical audit and so on, and then you mentioned the norms.
Yeah.
And I'm completely following that and tracking with that. But in the context of artificial intelligence, as we immerse ourselves with the best of intentions, will it create an artificial world? And then secondly, even with all the virtues and the Christian principles that we bring to bear upon this particular realm, we don't have any control over the technologies that are released. And we're forced, there is no democracy, right? We're forced into it. So no matter how much we want to hold onto these virtues, we are forced practically in a workspace to utilize these things or overutilize them. And so I'm wondering if the original design plan of God, Plantinga, who was teaching at Calvin many years ago, he talks about the original design plan of God, your cognitive capacities in the world in which he has created you, and there's a correspondence and you come to understand and know the world. But as we make the world more artificial, I wonder if we're moving away from that and we have no choice in it in some ways because the technologies are foisted on us.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit against sort of a deterministic view and inevitability kind of view. The forces are strong, to be sure. But I think in our larger lives, to quote, I think it's Neil Postman, to be a loving resistance fighter, or is it McLuhan? that we're called to be a loving resistance fighter. And I think that that's the posture we ought to have. Now, in the corporate world, you're right. If your boss says you got to do this, then you have to. And I think that's where you need wisdom, and you need a kind of winsome kind of attitude to try and influence as much as you can. And maybe people who have great marketable technical skills who could go anywhere might have to make decisions, ought to make decisions about where am I going to use my skills to build God's kingdom and to bring shalom nearer. And maybe working at this company, even though it has a great salary compensation, I'm not doing good. I need to think more than about economics. So I would push back. We're called to be a faithful presence, and maybe I'm speaking from a position of privilege because I have opportunities that people in other circumstances may not. But I think this is where we where we need to push back a little bit. Also in our own lives and the rhythms that we have and how we use these tools. Certainly in the church and in our Christian colleges, we have autonomy. We can decide, thus far you shall go and no further, right? With technology, and these are appropriate uses. So, but it's hard.
Let's say thanks to Dr. Schuurman. While Dr. Plantinga is getting set up here, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Harvey Plantinga, who is also from Calvin University, professor of computer science there, and of great interest to me, directs the Christian Classics Ethereal Library, ccel.org, and also hymnary.org. Both have been helpful to me in my prior work as a pastor. He's researching implications of AI for Christianity and spiritual formation, and as well ways in which AI may change the way we read books by adding interactive elements, asking questions, etc. Dr. Plantinga, I was thinking about my spiritual formation classes and saying to a student, your thoughts are so November 2022. You are so far behind the curve. And so we've had 2 great presentations so far, no pressure. We are excited for yours. So welcome, Dr. Plantinga.
Thank you. My name is Harvey Plantinga, and I have a personality disorder. Whenever I get my hands on a toy or a tool, I want to try it out and figure it out and play with it, right? I remember a time early in my marriage at my in-laws' house. They gave me an electric screwdriver, which was a novelty. And my mother-in-law likes to remind me that the first thing I did is take it out and start taking off doors. So this talk is a little different. It's experiments in AI and spiritual formation. 3 experiments. Just describe the experiment and say how it came, how it went. But before I do that, so the experiments are a smart library assistant, Christian Classics Ethereal Library, a book study discussion partner, and a coach for centering prayer. But before that, I just want to spend a couple minutes on a framework that may help interpret the results, understand the results, and in fact, hopefully understand the difference between people and machines. We'll see if you buy it. And I want to go back even further than these guys. I'm third. I have to stand out a little somehow. So I'm going to go back to the 1600s. Blaise Pascal was a philosopher, theologian, inventor, mathematician. And he invented the first mechanical calculator, the Pascaline, or the arithmetical machine, as he called it. And for his father, who was a tax assessor. And this caused an intellectual problem for him, much like the one that we're experiencing today, perhaps. And it was this. Here's a machine that can do something very much like thinking. This blows my mind. I used to think that people were rational animals, but now here's a machine that's doing something very like thinking. How do I understand this? And of course, this is a question that's come back many times over the years. His answer was, the arithmetical machine produces effects which approach nearer to thought than all the actions of animals, but it does nothing which would enable us to attribute will to it. And I think he had the answer for that time and the answer for today. Over the last 400 years, computation has only grown dramatically. But in the last 400 years, what progress has there been in machines that can convince you that they can sin, that they can do something opposite to their programming, that they have a will, that they can love, that they need salvation? My opinion would be none. So that's the model. What is it? Is humanity the rational animal? Maybe we should say humanity is the loving animal. So this model deals with meaning. Where does meaning reside? What kinds of meaning are there? And it's not all sorts of meaning that I'm listing here, but ones that are relevant for this context. And I have 4 different kinds of meaning. And the first to consider is, what if you have a book? It has words in it. Does the book understand anything? No. But there is meaning sort of encoded in the words of the book. But you have to have an intentional author encoding, writing those words, and a reader understanding them. So that's the sort of a lowest level form of meaning, symbolic meaning. Let's go to the third one, intentional meaning. This is meaning in terms of intentions, experiences, desires, loves, purpose. This is a kind of meaning that people work in all the time. And there seems to be a sort of a middle level between those, conceptual or connectionist meaning. And this has always been around, but now it's becoming apparent that you can separate the second and the third level, that you can have a conceptual understanding without the purpose, without the intent, without the love. And this conceptual level of meaning has to do with concepts in relation to each other. So I may have no clue what a bunny rabbit is, or what ears or a nose are, but I know that bunny rabbits have long ears and have a rabbit nose. I mean, I know the connections between the concepts without any kind of connection between those concepts and the real world. And then a last level of meaning, communal meaning, the co-created intentional meaning of a text shared in a community, the sharing of that meaning, the culture, art, worship. There's another kind of meaning that develops in community, I think. And where do these types of meaning reside? Books have symbolic meaning. They can act as a medium for other sorts of meaning, for intentional meaning, conceptual meaning, but they only work at the symbolic level. People, symbolic, conceptual, intentional. Large language models, here's what's new. Large language models can work at the conceptual level. They can have concepts, they can reason without the intentionality part. And then the last level of communal meaning only develops in community. Okay, so I have 3 experiments to describe. The first is, comes in 2 parts, AI Reader's Tools and a Smart Library Assistant. And this is the Christian Classics Ethereal Library. It was maybe the first digital library on the web. First showed up in 1994. And I don't really work on it anymore, or I haven't been, partly because of copyright law. All the books are public domain. Just about all the books are public domain. That makes them 100 years old. That makes the language a little dated. People prefer a modern translation. I ran a study with people working for me on the cloud of unknowing. This is a Middle English book written at about the time of Chaucer. Here beginneth a book of contemplation, the which is clept the cloud of unknowing, in the which a soul is one with God. Well, the people I was working with, we were studying this book, one of them wanted a modern translation. And so she called on ChatGPT-4. This was like 2-3 years ago. ChatGPT-4 was just out. And so she asked ChatGPT-4 to take the persona of a careful Christian scholar familiar with Christian mysticism and the history of theology, to update the language, to write a commentary on the side. And I was very surprised that it was good and it was useful. So this started me thinking about CCEL again. So here's one senior project from 3 computer science majors at Calvin, which completed half a year ago, called AI Readers Tools. The idea was we have this library of archaic language books or dated language. Does the large existence of large language models change the equation? Does it make it useful again? And then the question became even deeper. Can the way we interact with books change because of large language models? Can books become more interactive? Instead of just reading a book, searching through a book, can you have a conversation with a book? So that was this experiment. Take a book, add some tools, modernize the text, explain a section, historical context, historical, social, religious context, and there was a capability at the end to have a kind of Socratic dialogue with the book about the content of the chapter. And in these students' tests, these tools helped student engagement and comprehension. And so we had a second experiment, second part of this experiment with a different team, and they were addressing the question, why should I have to search through the book to find the quote I'm looking for or to find what it has to say about a certain topic? I should be able to ask the book, ask the library, what do the early church fathers have to say about the Trinity, right? And it ought to search through all the books in the library, find the most relevant ones, formulate them into a coherent answer with links so you can jump back to read the original sources. So that was the first experiment. Both of them went well, were successful, but they're prototypes, but we're actually working on implementing them in the library. And they do add a kind of interactive, engaging quality to using books. Whether that's good or bad, the change, I don't know. So in our tests, yes, AI can make book reading interactive. The tools increased comprehension. The Smart Library Assistant just dramatically changes the way research works. And maybe I should start thinking about CCEL again. Okay, second one, a book study discussion partner. So in this experiment, I was leading a discussion of another Middle English book, approximately the same time frame, same location in England. This book is called Revelations of Divine Love. And so, some chapters we're going to focus on. And the intent was this was an in-person thing. We sit around and we discuss these things. But a couple of people found this information online and said, can I follow along? Can I participate somehow remotely, even though I can't be there in person? And I thought, well, it seems to me that a lot of the value of this is in the discussion, right? You come together, you deal with, you apply what you've read to your life, other people's lives. You think about it in that perspective. And I thought, well, I wonder if a large language model could help. So let's see, maybe we could make a chatbot that's primed to hold this kind of discussion about the chapter and try to engage you in a deeper conversation. try to drive engagement. So I tried that. So here it is. Hello and welcome. So you're supposed to read the chapter, and then you're supposed to come here to the chat bot and hold your conversation. It invites you to discuss it, invites you to start out by summarizing a certain part, and then it will engage you in conversation to try to get at some of the deep themes of the reading. And I said, Julian says that God created everything, loves it, and preserves it, but it sure doesn't seem that way to me when someone I know, someone I love, is diagnosed with terminal cancer. Where's God's preservation? And here was the answer. I hear the deep pain and questioning in your response. It's one of the most challenging aspects of faith, reconciling the idea of a loving, preserving God with the harsh realities of suffering and loss. Would you feel comfortable sharing more about how you're wrestling with this apparent contradiction? Julian herself was writing during the Black Death and experienced severe illness, so she wasn't writing from a place of easy comfort. Let me ask, when you think about someone suffering from cancer, how do you understand what preservation might mean in that context? Does it necessarily mean preventing all physical harm, or could it mean something else? What do you think of that response? I see heads going both ways. I can't ask you to say what you said. I don't want to have this conversation with a computer. That's a good response. What do you think about the ethics of this response? Is there anything unethical about it? Pardon?
Well, the first two words.
I hear the deep pain and questioning in your response. It's compassionate, right? It's saying, I feel your pain. It's, I'm sorry, I have too many slides. I can't go into a deep conversation about this. But there is this ethical question of simulated compassion. Is that ethical? It's designed to engage, so it's helping oil the wheels of conversation, but it's also giving a false impression of who you're dealing with, what you're dealing with. So leaving that aside, the summary of this experiment: it can hold a good, deep, engaging conversation, but people didn't naturally open up to it. People would come, but they wouldn't type their deepest concerns and thoughts, right? There was bring your own intent, bring your own, it doesn't provide that or build it. And at a deeper level, it didn't really fulfill the role of the conversation. In the conversation, we listen to each other, we hear our pain, we share pain, we share our joys, and this kind of growing communal spirit, love, that compassion for each other that should develop. Well, it doesn't have the opportunity here. I'm using this in the wrong way. Okay, one more experiment. I'm running out of time. Centering prayer coach. So, I went the wrong way, sorry. So this book, The Cloud of Unknowing, is a famous book of prayer, contemplative prayer. Here's one part of it: lift up your heart to God with a gentle stirring of love, focus on Him alone. It's about attention, about paying attention to God and nothing else. Want Him, not anything He's made. Think on nothing but Him. Don't let anything else run through your mind and will. Forget everything that God made and everybody who exists and everything that's going on in the world. This is the work of the soul that most pleases God. This got formalized and simplified and systematized in something called Centering Prayer. There's this organization that has thousands of members and retreats all the time. And Centering Prayer is a very simplified version of what's in this book, The Cloud of Unknowing, and it has a few guidelines. You sit, choose a sacred word as a symbol of your consent to God's presence in action. You sit comfortably, and so on. I led a workshop here, and the problem with centering prayer is that it's very disorienting for beginners. So if I had time, I would ask you all to sit quietly for 3 minutes and think only about God, and then ask you how you did. And you can imagine, probably that wouldn't go so well. We don't really control our thoughts like that. And it's not about controlling thoughts. It's about returning to God, returning your attention to God. But it's something that provides challenge, difficulty for beginners. So the daily exercise here in this, from this workshop, there would be a daily short reading, there would be a centering prayer exercise, and then there would be a journaling exercise where you reflect on that. And there were 2 options. One was on paper, your normal journal, and one was an interactive journal powered by a large language model, Journey. And it would say something like, hello and welcome to this time of reflection. I'm Journey, your companion. How did things go for you? My mind wouldn't quiet down. I kept thinking of things I need to do, people who said things that make me feel bad, all sorts of other things. That's such a common experience in centering prayer. You're certainly not alone in this. The mind naturally does what minds do, think, plan, worry. So it was supportive, and it had suggestions for difficulties, and it was willing to engage deeply in related areas. Encouraging. So I did this actually with 2 different groups, and it was very interesting. About most people were kind of off-put by the idea of using AI in this context, and so a few tried it out. And then the next week they came and said, "This was really helpful. This was great." And then a whole bunch more tried it out. And they said things like, "I was suspicious at first, but when I finally tried it, it was actually very helpful. It was just so dang encouraging and supportive. It helped me realize things about myself that I wasn't aware of. I'm in love." That was a joke. What's my conclusion from this? What's the difference here? People came directly from prayer, from being deeply in prayer. And in that state, they were ready to have hour-long, deeply moving conversations that led them to tears. They found it very helpful and encouraging. The thing that was potentially most useful, or most, the support, answering questions, support, encouraging, that was all useful. But another thing that was useful was a mirroring function. So I say, well, I had all of these thoughts, these distractions, and it would sort of mirror back to you what you were saying in different words. So you see yourself from a different perspective, and you come to realize more about what's going on inside yourself, right? It's like what happens in therapy when the therapist says, what do you think about that? Keeps asking questions. It's getting you to probe within yourself. And it was useful in that respect. So that did seem to be successful. I should probably stop since I'm several minutes over.
Let's entertain some questions.
I have a question about just the reliability. I'm thinking about the interaction books. So like, if I'm a teacher and I'm teaching a new poem that day and I don't have a ton of time to do a ton of research, and I ask a good AI bot for an analysis, what level of reliability can I have of its results? It's kind of like we used to say don't even read Wikipedia at all, and now and we still say don't cite it, but we do often say it is a good place to start. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts
Yeah. Hallucination is, as we heard earlier, a declining problem. But hallucination really isn't the issue here because it's not quotes you're getting, it's sort of summaries. And it's generally good at that. I haven't seen any problems that I've been aware of. Yes.
I was curious, when you're reading on the first one, the assistant, it kind of reminded me why I quit reading text online. Because you had all the hyperlinks that kept inviting you to become distracted. And do you ever worry that the technology is transforming the narrative into merely a warehouse of information? Because story is not the same, I mean, they're not synonymous.
Yeah, so there are lots of user interface questions as well with digital texts. And as you say, distractions is a big one. And this was just a student prototype, not ready for prime time. But yeah, one would want to think carefully about attention and distraction in any kind of reading interface.
This might be a question for all of you, but, or one of you, whoever wants to take it up. My instinct when I think about relationships with a chatbot, right, it is obviously to stay away from that. People should be helping people. But I recognize through diverse reading and conversations that many people don't have access to helpful people, or they're not aware of who those helpful people might be in their lives. And therapy is expensive. Some people are very much living in non-supportive environments, isolated. Where would you put boundaries around using this technology as a tool to help people who are struggling with those types of problems?
Yes, sometimes you'll hear the response that it makes two classes of people: those who have access to chatbots and those who have access to real spiritual directors or real doctors. I don't think it's that simple myself. I just the other day I went to Dr. ChatGPT before I went to my real doctor. I don't know. Does anyone else want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think one thing I think about it is I think our imagination around the application and the user interface of AI has been so solely focused on chatbot, and it's very limiting, I think. I think that the chatbot has a lot of good features if you want your user. I haven't heard of anybody who's addicted to Google search, let's just say that, right? Who just like can't get away from typing things into Google, right? But like people are gonna get and are getting addicted to ChatGPT, the chatbot interface. That's the interface. And so there's a lot of decisions, even when you think about the fact that ChatGPT, whether it's the spinner verbs I told you before, where it's like ruminating, thinking, or even just the interface. Like the reason that ChatGPT and large language models took off at all is because they figured out the UI. It's got this little ... thinking thing. And then on top of that is all of the personal pronouns. I feel, I hear, it's like, no, you don't, right? It's straight out of scripture again, right? Like they'll have eyes but not be able to see, ears and cannot hear. Like though that's what we're dealing with right now. To answer your question, I think of the tool of large language models and AI can be very useful in these types of applications. I truly believe that. But I think our imagination has to get out of the chatbot interface, I think, is a road going the wrong way.
Quickly continue that scripture. Those who make them will become like them, and so will those who use them, right? So it's actually damaging, right? So there was this latest article in the ACM, Communication of the ACM, which talks about how chatbots might be able to solve loneliness. Or they won't feel lonely, but they're still socially isolated. It's a relationship of one person, and it actually damages you for a real, genuine, authentic relationship. Maybe this is the place where the church needs to step in a world of loneliness to provide. I would still say it's harmful. And then once companies monetize this and start sending advertisements and kind of, making it addictive, it's going to become even more problematic. So yeah, a good movie, Lars and the Real Girl, which is kind of an interesting take on some of the stuff.
One thought that came to mind during all of your talks was thinking back to how, in some sense, the old Turing test is very outdated. It's become very naive. But it seems like one of the issues is, from what we're saying, is that it's like some people are willing to accept that the AIs have passed the Turing test.
Yeah, what I think is most interesting about this new era, it was already alluded to earlier, people are realizing that ChatGPT is really good at some things and has broad knowledge, great use of language, and yet something's missing. And yet something's missing. What is that thing? And that's the intentionality, the purpose from my perspective. But everybody has to deal with that question now. What's missing from ChatGPT? And that's leading people to understand people better. Yeah.
I really appreciated the walking us through these experiments. I mean, I think there might be no more powerful way to get to understand the nuances and intricacies than to run experiments like this in our environments and in our institutions. And I'm just struck, I wonder if the content of Cloud of Unknowing had anything to do with your openness to running these experiments, the very content of the book itself.
Yeah, so it's a contemplative book, so it deals with awareness and attention and
I'm somewhat familiar with it. So I
and
wondered if
yes, I think that left people in a recollected state where they were very open to this kind of conversation and this deep thinking. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.